Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Thank you again for joining us today and for this webinar on global change in urban forests with Dr. Mark Chandler, who you can see his face up here on the screen with me. This is the third webinar in our forest series. I'm Diana Bell, Earthwatch's multimedia manager, and I'm excited to introduce Mark, who's actually my colleague. He is Earthwatch's Director of Research Initiatives. Mark has worked at Earthwatch for over 15 years, and he oversees the design and management of field research projects that engage people in over 35 countries. Prior to this, he was a research scientist with the New England Aquarium. Before I hand the webinar over to Mark, I just wanted to let you all know that if you have any questions at any point, you can feel free to submit them through the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of the screen. Or if you want to, you can also use the chat function, but it'll be easier for us to manage the questions at the end through the Q&A feature. Yeah, that's all I have. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you and welcome. I won't be able to see it, but I have my friend the frog behind me here. And it just reminds me to share that I started my life as a field biologist working more in sort of forests around the world and in the Amazon or in Africa. And roughly about 10 years ago, I was working on different projects and I was talking with a colleague from the UK. And he said, actually in England, the biggest forest is the forest around London, including the forest in London. And it reminded me to see that actually urban forests are a really important part of our global ecosystem. And since then, we've really looked at being able to explore and understand urban forests globally. And I'm happy to be able to share some of what I've learned in some of the Earthwatch projects with respect to that going forward. This is a picture of Earth at night. And it's probably the sort of a nice way of understanding where cities are around the world. And we can see that they're sort of represented a little bit everywhere. And it's sort of,
sorry, you forgot to share your screen with us.
Oh.
Soon we'll be able to see that picture of Earth at night.
Sorry.
Perfect.
There we go. That's better. I was wondering, I couldn't see the picture on the side. Yeah, this is a picture of the world at night with cities, and we can see just how ubiquitous they are. They dominate a lot of our global environment. One of the aspects about cities that's super important is that they're actually growing in terms of their importance, in terms of how many people live there, and also in terms of the sort of geography that they encompass. On the left-hand side, you can see a graph with the red line being the growth and how many people are in cities. And you can see that sort of inflection point with the blue line, which is how many people who live in the rural areas of the world. So roughly around 2008 or so is the point where more people started living in cities than actually in the countryside. If you look on the bottom map of the world, in green are all those countries where people live more frequently in cities to a great extent, such as North America, South America, certainly much of Europe and Australia, in parts of the world where still there's either many people or more people who live in the countryside. But if you look at change in the world, it's on all those areas that are in the yellow or in the reds where people are starting to move to cities. And so cities are becoming a more dominant aspect of where people live, the kinds of challenges that we need to think about. I included the picture up on the upper right-hand side, and that's the city of Ontario in Southern California. It's a place where we do work at Earthwatch, but it just reminds me to reflect that cities are more than simply probably the darker splotches that you see on that image which is sort of residential homes, but there's a lot of other infrastructure. These are all warehouses where our TVs, our cell phones are stored before they get moved around. There's an airport. There's a lot more that happens in cities than simply people's homes, and it's thinking about that sort of totality of the environment that is important. When we think about how to manage cities for human health, for sustainability, we have to consider, what are those trends that are happening, and how do we think about managing cities for those trends? Well, one of those trends is demographic change. So there's a huge influx of people. There's both birth rates, but people moving from the countryside into cities that we need to think. The density of people is increasing. There's suburbia. Um, Economic inequality is something that is also being exacerbated, and so you can have big homes and either slums or trailer parks or small settlements. How do we deal and manage economic inequality? There's also a huge change in terms of the increase in vulnerable populations that exist in cities. So as we have natural disasters, hazards, whether it's a loss of electricity, need to provide services, how do we consider vulnerable people within cities to be able to design programs that support them? And there's also sort of social demographic changes, cultural diversity changes that need to be considered in terms of migration, in terms of increasing, for example, in the US, Latino populations. But those kinds of ethnic changes are happening in every major city around the world. And that changes how we think about the values and the kinds of programs and what makes up a rich, sustainable, healthy city. One of the aspects that's super important at Earthwatch, but also a component of increasing amounts of work in cities, is thinking about that racial diversity and environmental justice, and how, depending upon one's background, where one lives, access to nature, access to services is not equally distributed. So this is actually a map of Los Angeles. If you look, and maybe I can use the mouse here, you have the sort of ports of Long Beach and San Pedro down here in the bottom. You've got sort of downtown Los Angeles and Beverly Hills up on the upper left-hand side. And so you can see the sort of racial makeup predominantly across neighborhoods of Los Angeles, with the purples being the sort of more Hispanic communities, the sort of the pinks and reds being Asian communities. There's a sort of some Black communities, non-Hispanic Black communities, close to LAX and down here. And then the rest of it is what they would consider some non-Hispanic white communities. When you map that on access to green space and parks, you can see quite a sort of correlation or an overlap between the racial makeup of communities and whether they have access to parks. So in the case here, the reds mean that there's almost no access to parks, and the green means that they do have access to parks. And you can see that, especially if you focus on the Hispanic purple sort of communities, that there's almost a one-to-one match between whether it's the central part of LA or the parts of the San Fernando or down towards the Inland Empire, that there's actually this overlay where more vulnerable, perhaps poor communities and ones that predominantly have Hispanics have almost no access to green. So how do we think about programs that make sure that we address that and we understand how to get green, trees, and so on into those areas? And it's not just access to nature that's important. We can also, for example, map, in this case, human health attributes, asthma hospitalizations, and again, that same pattern emerges. Now, this is not a cause and effect kind of relationship, and so we need to understand what causes asthma or access to parks or other kinds of drivers. But in these sort of reinforced patterns that different communities, disadvantaged communities, have different access to nature and other goods and services, is driving a lot of the work in cities today in terms of what we think about in terms of a healthy city, a sustainable city, a resilient city. And this is something that's important for our work here at Earthwatch. Beyond the kinds of change that we see in terms of human demographics in cities, I think we're all aware that there's a lot of other kinds of changes that are happening to planet Earth that we need to consider as we think about creating a sustainable, healthy urban environment. And in fact, you could sort of pick and choose whatever thread or cause that there is, whether it's climate change or biodiversity or pollution or waste or food safety. These are all factors that we need to think about in terms of creating a sustainable, healthy city. We're probably all aware also that climate change is occurring. Here, this is a sort of a representation, and you can see from the 1960s going up, so from where the bright sun is, that we've already increased the temperature over a sort of that baseline of 19th century about 1 degree. And with that change, we're already observing a number of impacts on cities that tell us about how they're working and what kinds of solutions we might devise to be able to help people. Of course, if the planet warms further to 1.5 degrees, which is what the global community has suggested as a sort of reasonably safe threshold, or if we don't do enough to cut it back and it leads to 2, all these impacts will be magnified further still. So in terms of looking at the kinds of change that we'll see on a global level, I've sort of organized them in a way that I think is a useful way of looking at it. The biggest sorts of changes are what we could consider sort of more supercharged weather events. And so these are the kinds of events that we've all heard in terms of, the biggest magnitude are things like hurricanes. But in fact, even from there are a number of other smaller to medium-sized storms that can have a sort of large impact on the well-being of cities. In terms of the storms, there's obviously wind effects that can knock down trees, that can rip out houses and such. There's a lot of rain and intense rain that leads to inland flooding is one of the kinds of impacts. Coastal flooding, in particular in cities like Boston, where we're situated, is a huge kind of effect where you combine sort of storms sweeping up the water up into the coastlines as well as the inland water sort of flowing over, and you can get a lot of coastal flooding and damage to property and threats to humans. And the other kind of sort of storm weather related kinds of events have to do with the planet getting hotter and drier. And with that, you get more extreme heat events, which can be a huge threat to humans. It can lead to prolonged droughts. And just in California, where we do some of our work, there have been some extended droughts that stress both availability of water to humans, but also to natural ecosystems. And certainly in the news, whether you're in Australia or recently in California, we get the sort of conditions between the heat, the dryness, and the winds that can blow fires way out of proportion and really threaten human livelihoods, ecosystems, property. And so all of these combination as a result of climate change are being exacerbated. And those are the kinds of threats that we're thinking about when we're looking to create livable cities with respect to climate change. I wanted to go into a little bit of detail about both the sort of temperature profiles and the flooding, as it helps think about how we want trees and green in cities. This is looking at California as a case example, and similar kinds of profiles you could see in many other states. So here we look at how California has changed and will change in terms of temperature, and you can see you can map out from places that used to be sort of extremely hot in the south eastern part of the state are migrating further north and towards the coast. So the coast will always be buffered somewhat because of the cold waters there, but that sort of hotter, drier air is sort of pushing inland north of Los Angeles and the Central Valley. So we can plan for that, we understand that, but what does that mean? Well, they've actually done a number of projections looking at the number of extreme heat days, which are days above 100 degrees. And if you look on the bottom axis on the sort of figure with the 3 bars, you can see sort of an east to west gradient, with Palm Springs being the tallest bars, sort of Riverside, San Gabriel Valley, moving sort of from the hot, dry desert to Santa Monica, which is on the coast. And you can see with the lightest bars being the days, average number of days where you have extreme heat between 1981 and 2000. So for example, in Riverside, California, it used to be 58. It's expected by 2050 to be almost double that at 96. And then by 2100, it's 128. So these are dramatic changes that will affect humans in terms of their need to cool, but also habitats, the trees, the ecosystems that support life in these cities. Um, in fact, heat waves, even though we sort of think that they're sort of maybe occasional sporadic kinds of events, kill more people in the US than all the other weather-related events combined. The other thing that I think is important to remember in terms of heat is that I think we often think, especially up here in the Northeast, that, oh, it's those people in Phoenix perhaps or Los Angeles that are most vulnerable to these extreme heat events. But in fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that places that are already hot have some measures of adaptation to heat. And it's in fact those areas that are cooler that are most vulnerable. So it's in the Chicagos or maybe even the Northeast or San Francisco that actually you'll see more loss of life or extreme sickness because of heat. And so this change in temperature is important, and it's important across the whole country and certainly globally. One of the aspects that accentuates this problem of changing temperature is something called the urban heat island effect. And that is the fact that cities, independent of climate change, in fact, are naturally hotter or unnaturally hotter, perhaps. And on average, they're about 3 to 10 degrees Celsius hotter, which is around between 7 and 15 degrees hotter Fahrenheit. And the reason for that is we've removed all the green bits, the trees, the parks, as well as some of the blue bits, some of the lakes, and instead we've replaced them with asphalt, which holds the heat from the sun and re-radiates it back out at night. And that switch from sort of green to gray has led to a natural heating of cities. I think this is a particularly nice graph here that sort of gives you a visual representation of how late afternoon temperature, which is where you see some of the greatest differences, is different from moving from a rural in the eastern part, or the sort of left-hand side, if you wish, towards the city core where it gets hotter and then back out, depending upon the number of trees. Gives you a sense that cities not only will have this sort of climate change effect, but they're already hotter still. And in that way, there's a lot of science and management that's going into thinking that maybe cities give us insights as to where the world as a whole is going, because they're already a couple of degrees warmer from that perspective. If we look at flooding and the effects of increased storms, here we can see on the graph the increase in frequency of these very heavy rain events. So it's not sort of the light rains that happen from time to time, from week to week, but instead it's those steady storms. And if you map the change in their occurrence, you can see in the eastern part of North America, there's been a dramatic rise up to 71% in the Northeast, where Earthwatch is based, 37 and 27% in the eastern half. So these are just the increase in these very heavy rain events. Now, our infrastructure is not built to handle these kinds of rain events. And so because of that, you can get the flooding, as you can see in this street. And I just heard, in fact, a report on NPR last night where they've done a study, and there's something like 130 or 150 dams across the US that they've identified are at risk of bursting if there's increase in these very heavy rain events, because they simply weren't made for this change in the weather and the amount of rain now coming down into these watersheds. If we look at why flooding events are particularly bad in cities, again, it's that same story where we've replaced a lot of the green bits, the trees, the soil that could infiltrate the water, and instead replaced it with all these impervious surfaces that just pool the water and funnel it down into these channels, into these streams, flooding houses and roadways and so on. So again, it's that same story that we saw with the extreme heat, and what's happening in that less green, more gray means that we have exacerbated problems. So we've seen a number of these kinds of changes in cities that connect with climate change as a result of the loss of green and the gray. And at Earthwatch over the last 10 years, we've really looked at building out our cities-based programs where we think that we could take our sort of citizen science model or community science model and bring it into cities and see how can we bring, rigorous science and an engaged community to be able to address some of these problems so that we can adapt and maybe mitigate some of the effects of climate change. So we have 3 different kinds of urban science programs at Earthwatch. We have ones that sort of come into the green infrastructure, which is a sort of fancy way of talking about trees and parks, which I'll get into in a minute. We have a different sort of kind of programs dealing with the water issues, whether it's too much water and flooding or not enough water during droughts, and how do we water just the right amount so we save water, yet we still keep our lawns or our trees alive. We have a third kind of initiative around air quality. Air quality, in fact, is one of the biggest threats to human health. And how can we understand that so we can minimize exposure to high levels of pollution? One of the common themes that I'm most excited about in terms of all this is that each of these ties back to what we call nature-based solutions. So how can we use nature? How can we get green back or blue back into cities so that it provides all these different benefits to people? And I want to describe sort of a few of the programs that we have that I'm excited about. What is an urban forest, and how do we think about trees? Well, an urban forest is in fact all the trees that you find in a city. So it could be street trees, it could be trees in parks, and in fact a lot of the trees exist on private lands, and some of those are sort of university campuses or hospital campuses, but a lot of them are in backyards of residences. And so if you add up all those trees over all those different kinds of places, that sort of comprises the urban forest. In many cities, it ranges between about 20% to 30%. Cities now are trying to move from 30 to perhaps 35%, recognizing a lot of the benefits of having trees. But that sort of is what we think about in terms of the urban forest. Some of the language that you may have heard of, and certainly that I'm using here, that sort of talks about trees, includes green infrastructure and or nature-based solutions. And I just want to take a minute because this is something they may hear about, but it helps also think about in terms of how do we create programs that actually build cities for sustainability in the future. So the term green infrastructure was actually developed from more of a planning kind of or management of cities perspective. So the landscape architects, the planners, the city managers think of landscape of infrastructure, where to invest in different kinds of infrastructure. And so the people who are interested in nature and trees sort of coined this term of green infrastructure to think about how do we put investing in green infrastructure on the same sort of playing field as thinking about investing in roads or sewer pipes or buildings and such. And it's actually been quite effective at being able to bring the concept of nature into planning decisions by thinking of it as green infrastructure. So at Earthwatch, we care a lot about bringing the sort of science and making it useful to managers and to lead to action. And so often we think of it from a green infrastructure perspective. Nature-based solutions is a term often used by more community-based organizations, people who really want to promote the value of nature in cities. And it's really helpful from that perspective, but it hasn't sort of trickled into the sort of management side of decision-making in cities. But it's a very helpful comment or concept to think about. And often people are being quite creative about thinking about nature in cities in terms of roof gardens or living walls or a lot of other ways of sort of weaving in nature back into cities to provide some of the benefits that we have. I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of benefits because identifying those benefits of green infrastructure help city managers who have limited budgets to make decisions where to invest. And I've already talked about a couple of these kinds of benefits. One is sort of the reduced flood risk by having more green and more soil associated with it. Another is the sort of shading and cooling benefits. But if we start adding up all these other co-benefits that trees can bring, whether it's habitat for biodiversity, whether it's improved air, urban foraging, educational opportunities for schools, we can see that in fact trees, and by reintegrating nature back into cities, can provide a lot of different benefits. And that's what's got a lot of people excited about getting more nature into cities. And so now there isn't so much of a discussion about getting trees back into cities. And in fact, there are many programs in most cities that are tree planting efforts. And so I've just thrown up is a number of different kinds of efforts to get trees back out there, reintegrate trees into the environment, which is all great. And there's been a huge change. However, there are a number of challenges that have come up. One is that there's not enough space now to put in trees. You know, it's replaced by parking lots or houses or buildings, and we're very reluctant to lose those houses. And so we really have to understand the benefits and economics of being able to bring in more trees. But there's so many other questions that are coming about, and those are opportunities for us to bring science and community engagement and the participation of many volunteers which are needed to be able to understand the kinds of benefits, you know, how well are trees doing? Are they growing? Are they dying? Which ones are doing better? How can we increase the survivorship of young trees? So in the city of Cambridge and in many cities, it costs roughly around $300 each to put put trees into our cities. And so how do we increase their survivorship so that that money is well spent? So these are the kinds of questions that we've taken on board, and we've devised a number of sort of research projects to be able to bring the community science and the participation of volunteers to be able to answer and feed them back to cities to be able to make decisions. I want to talk with you about two of these different kinds of programs. One is that we had here in Cambridge, which is just across the river from our offices. This is a program that we launched in collaboration with some scientists and with the city of Cambridge. And the city of Cambridge was really excited about having some science done to help them understand how to manage their urban forest. And so there, the project was focused on trying to understand the sort of growth and the survivorship of different trees. So the citizens of the community of Cambridge were interested in making sure that they had a healthy urban forest, and they're concerned that they're losing a lot of trees. The city wasn't quite sure which ones were dying, which ones were not. They're getting conflicting information from some of their citizens. And so they were happy to partner together with scientists and Earthwatch and volunteers to be able to understand this better. So we got teams of volunteers to go out and measure trees. And in fact, every year we had somewhere between 100 and 120 different kinds of volunteers. And we got over 9,000 different trees measured that were able to crunch down and do some analysis. And that data helped feed into a management plan that the city used, as well as a scientific publication. You may ask, well, what do people do in terms of trees? Are these easy tasks that we can get community scientists or citizen scientists to be able to collect? Well, we looked at what kinds of species existed, and we could give people guidelines in terms of what the species were. They could look at the measurement in terms of the diameter of a tree, and here you have a picture of a sort of what they call a DBH, a diameter tape that you sort of wrap around the tree and get a sort of diameter. You can look at the condition of the tree. You can look at some of the features around it that might influence the survivorship. So all of these kinds of factors, we're able to train teams of volunteers to go out and collect the data to be able to understand. We had a huge diversity of kinds of participants. We had even corporate volunteer days would go out and collect trees. We had parents and their kids. We had teachers. We had youth teams. Girl science clubs went out. And for Earthwatch, it's a really interesting experiment because we're used to bringing volunteers out to the field on field expeditions. We weren't quite sure, could we recreate some of that magic in terms of getting community scientists involved? And we saw a great response and good science coming out from these kinds of efforts. One question that always comes out in sort of community science, citizen science, how good is the quality of the data? And so this is just an illustration that the data collected by these volunteers after about 20 minutes of training and some verification came out really very good. So you can see on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, the sort of the numbers that the volunteers collected. On the y-axis, you can see what a scientist got when they remeasured that same tree or measured it beforehand. And you can see there's almost a perfect sort of one-to-one match. There are a few outliers that we can sort of take care of. But in fact, if we compare sort of the volunteers to the scientists, it's no different in terms of the kinds of quality that if we compare two scientists. So we're really happy with the data collected by the volunteers, and we're able to use it for our management planning and science. in terms of some of the results, we found some trees, the Norway maples and the lindens, doing much more poorly, other trees doing better. We were able to engage the city managers, and they were able to, some of it they sort of knew, some of it was new to them. And this was able to really help them in terms of thinking about their management plan. We could do the same thing with young trees. And there we found actually that trees planted in the spring did a lot better than trees planted later in the summer or in the fall. And so we're able to give recommendations back to the city in terms of when to plant the trees, what kinds of trees. So this sort of combination of science, engaging the community, and city managers really was able to help think about the kinds of management that we need to do to manage cities going forward. One other kind of analysis that we're able to do with this kind, and this is something that happens in cities around the world, is trying to understand the sort of spatial variability of how well trees do and where there's missing amounts of green. And so we're able to look at, in this case, the sort of survivorship of trees in different communities. And the city managers were able to use this and identify different strategies to be able to help mitigate some of the threats and maybe identify other opportunities for increasing the amount of green. So this is a sort of a nice illustration of how getting many hands out there to do monitoring and science can help feed into management decisions to return the green into cities, to have those kind of healthy cities that provide all the benefits that we were talking about earlier in the talk. These are the sort of management plans and reports that the city of Cambridge was able to get through the sort of 9,000 trees and the hundreds of volunteer hours. What was interesting to see is that the city was able then to take this data and to look at, okay, moving forward, how do we want to grow the urban forest of Cambridge? And what kinds of decisions and how do we bring the public along to support those kinds of investments? These kinds of monitoring programs are in fact happening all over the country. Probably not too far from you, you'll see a sort of either a tree planting effort or a local volunteering effort around trees. And each one of those provides opportunities for helping cities understand better what's happening with cities in terms of the trees, and learning about our environment and contributing to making cities greener and healthier. The second project I wanted to touch upon briefly is a project called Operation Healthy Air, which we're doing in Southern California, and now we're expanding it a bit more globally. And it's really sort of thinking about this interaction between trees and healthy air that we breathe. One of the things that we wanted to do is sort of tie in some of those benefits that we talked about with trees to be able to understand, how do we think about a healthy urban environment. So in this case, a couple of years ago, we put out weather stations and ozone sensors and temperature sensors, and we're able to get them into people's backyards. And in fact, one of the hardest parts about doing urban work is that most of the science happens, where cities are, on street pavements, but actually most of the cities occur behind the sidewalk. And working with community scientists and community members and organizations, we're able to get in people's backyards and to those areas that are much harder and really understand how cities work. This particular volunteer really loved her cat, and I thought it was kind of fun to see her wanting to make sure that the cat was in this picture. That was part of a sort of news clipping here. Actually, in terms of recruiting other community scientists, this picture was one of the best outreach pieces that we had, because people love to sort of do science, but also bring in their sort of family members, so to speak, into the project. One little snippet in terms of results is that we could see that different trees and size of trees actually had a big effect on the temperature that they had in their backyards and their front yards, and that this change in temperature in the front yards and backyards, in part driven by trees, influenced ozone pollution in Southern California, which is still a problem. It was a much bigger problem in the 70s, but it's still a problem. And so you can see in the graph here, the yellow line is for a bigger tree, a crepe myrtle tree, and the green line is for a smaller tree. And you can see across a 24-hour period, so 10 o'clock being the morning, and you can see the peak around 2, 3 o'clock, that in the middle of the afternoon, that smaller trees provide much less cooling benefits than the crepe myrtles, which are in the yellow lines. And through this study, we're able to look at thousands of trees and start teasing apart which kinds of trees and the size of trees provide these kinds of cooling benefits. And the reason that the residents and the managers were really happy with this is that people didn't want to plant too big a tree, because sometimes they're big limbs, it means they lost some other parts of their garden, unless they knew that that bigger tree provided certain amount of benefits in terms of temperature reduction. And by looking at the data here, they're able to better inform those kinds of decisions in terms of the relationship between how much green, what kinds of green, the kinds of benefits that occur as we reshape and we bring back sort of nature into our cities. So I've just given you a couple sort of snippets of the kinds of ways that we can use citizen science to be able to answer those questions about how to bring back nature into cities to provide those benefits. And this is just, I find, a kind of a nice snapshot of quantifying those benefits in terms of what's there. At one level, it's great to know that trees are useful, but on the other hand, in terms of deciding how much of a municipal budget needs to go into restoring trees, how much extra maintenance money needs to go into keeping trees and forests, having hard numbers helps justify investing in green infrastructure rather than gray infrastructure. So this just gives you a sort of snapshot in terms of cooling benefits or reduced runoff or carbon, or on the bottom right-hand side, this absorbs phosphorus. And so a lot of stream pollution comes from this sort of runoff of rainwater into streams. And by having a combination of both the plants, but also the soil, it helps prevent a lot of the pollution that goes into our rivers. And so we like to think of trees as some of the hardest working community members we have that provide a sort of healthy, vibrant city. So what do trees need to thrive? So we know trees are good. We're getting a better understanding of what needs to work to make them happen. But how do we make sure trees survive and thrive in cities? Well, we know they need to have water and sunlight, so being thoughtful about the buildings, and they need to have enough space to grow and soil and nutrients. And those are sort of basics. But there's actually a different lens that I think I want to leave you with in terms of thinking about how you or the communities can really help trees thrive, since we know they're beneficial. So one key aspect is the healthy start piece. So especially when you see young trees, cities would really benefit from having people help water them, make sure that we don't attach bikes to them or knock them over, allow them to get a chance to get settled and really start growing. Not sort of crowding out trees too much is important. Being careful about not putting pavement or driveways or streets too close to trees, and giving that space to grow and thrive, because a big tree produces so many more benefits than a small tree. Some sort of levels of protection from heat and wind and so on are all key aspects that communities and municipalities can look to provide trees to provide us with all those benefits that allows cities to thrive, and all these people who live there, including in vulnerable communities, to be able to survive. The last thing I'd like to leave you with is that in our discussions with the municipalities, that one of the biggest missing pieces to really boosting our nature-based investment is that they need communities to be able to help in many ways, whether it's these monitoring programs in terms of the tree planting programs, but also just taking care of trees and being willing to stand up in public meetings and be able to say, we want more trees, how can I help? And so over the 10 years that I've been working on trees in cities, it's been wonderful to see this sort of transition from a sort of a more novel idea to this real movement of investing in trees and seeing a real rejuvenation and a return of nature into cities, which hopefully will make all of our lives much better. And with that, I want to thank you for listening, and I'm open to any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. We have gotten quite a few great questions. So the first one, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, is from Cito. He asks, how can we get our city for him, New Orleans, him or her, sorry, New Orleans, involved in this urban forest program? What would be your recommendations for actions to take to move into that direction?
Well, I think there are two different avenues. So one is looking for organizations that work directly with trees, and there are often many community-based organizations that have local tree planting efforts. Another way is community gardens are hugely valuable, and I would look to sort of local farming and gardening efforts, and they often need hands and provide opportunities. The other is to go to public events and sort of stand up and say, you know, what are you doing about the trees, and how can I help? And when I've talked to many city managers, they sort of feel there's a lot of competing interests, and the more people that can stand up and say, you're not doing enough, and please do something more, it gives them more ammunition, if you wish, or weight in their discussions as to where to spend their time. And so even though it may not feel that they're listening, often the city managers tell me, at least, that they really value people standing up and sort of wanting city managers to do more, because that gives them extra impetus. Because just about every city manager I've talked with across the country wants to do more. It's more a matter of limited resources.
Great. And then we got a couple of questions kind of along this same line. One is from Beth. She's wondering, talking about greening with trees, but shouldn't we be looking at native plants, marshes, and other ways to create urban landscapes that are as good, if not sometimes better than trees? In her example, she's talking about San Francisco, which was never a forest, but a dune. So watering trees is expensive and uses resources we don't really have. It seems to make more sense to talk about other aspects of greening cities. So what are your thoughts on that, Mark?
That's a great point. And certainly we do a lot of work in Southern California, and certainly LA was not a natural forest, and those kinds of trade-offs and issues are big. No, you're absolutely right. We need to think of the right kinds of nature in those areas, and simply importing big trees may not be the right solution in those cases. And similarly, it is really worthwhile looking at restoring, rehabilitating natural ecosystems rather than trying to come up with novel ecosystems. And so I think in terms of setting those priorities and looking at greening or nature-based solutions, then there isn't one size fits all, and simply putting more trees is not the right solution. So you're absolutely right. I think there are some interesting questions in places like Los Angeles or Phoenix or San Francisco, where it's already not a natural environment, and where trees can provide some big benefits, a lot of shade, and provide some aesthetic value and different kinds of nature-based and sort of values. And so thinking about whether the trade-off of some water for a tree is worthwhile may be appropriate, but it's absolutely a sort of local decision, and thinking about what's native and natural is really important to sort of thinking about our green infrastructure.
Great. And this question kind of gets to what you were saying about cities allowing trees to have the space they need to grow. This one is from our friend Bill Muma. Hi, Bill. How can we get cities to place electric wires underground so that the destructive maiming of trees to let wires pass through them? Also, the space between the curb and the sidewalk is too narrow to give trees the room they need. So I guess kind of wondering, what can we do or say to cities? How can we convince them to give trees the space they need?
I think often where I've seen that those efforts have been successful is when cities need to invest in tearing up a street and replacing a sewer works or some other big infrastructure, and that mostly cities don't do that kind of big work unless there's a lot of other factors that require them to tear up a street and restore it in some way. And I think the decisions at that point to take advantage of those opportunities is, how can we come up with the economic arguments about how much cooler having a big tree occur, is, rather than one that needs to be pruned because there are overhead wires, whether there's any air quality benefits, whether there's aesthetic benefits. Streets that have big trees, people tend to stay longer, so people shop for more. Restaurants that have big trees, people spend more money there. So there are a lot of really important health and economic values to trees. And I think that's one of the things that we've hoped to bring, but others are looking at what are the economic values that help those decisions move more into some of those costly changes in the short term that would lead to long-term benefits in terms of not having overhead wires that lead to all sorts of problems in terms of power being cut during storms, let alone trimming trees to small trees when in fact they should be nice big trees. Great question.
I thought this next question was really interesting. It's kind of getting to, with our urban resiliency program, some of the events were one-day tree measuring events. This question is about tree planting event. He asks, how can student groups further their understanding of urban forests after a tree planting event? My green team has participated in NYC's Million Trees project for many years now, and I would like them to be able to see that this is more than just a one-day event.
Great question. So 2 additional kinds of activities, and I would say, for a citizen science, community science-based organization, that's one of our favorite kinds of questions, because we really value the opportunity of engaging with nature in a deeper, more immersive way that deepens learning and appreciation. And so there are other kinds of community science projects, some of them looking at pests, because one of the threats to urban forests is proliferation of invasive species and pests. And so there's some early pest detection kinds of apps and citizen science projects that are available. And if we can identify when pests are moving in to some of the urban forests, we can tell the city foresters to prevent the pests from spreading more quickly. And in fact, having many eyes and hands out there looking for pests can really increase the saving of some of our most precious trees. So early warning around pest detection is one. The other is something called phenology. So the seasonality of when trees leaf out and the fruiting is something that's also quite popular. There's a series of citizen science activities that you can do with students or by yourself. The National Phenology Network has a great program where you can effectively adopt trees and look at changes over the season of when they leaf out, when they flower, when they fruit, and understanding how climate change and differential temperature affects that is a big research question, and having more people measuring the timing, the seasonality of leafing out and fruiting is another kind of activity that you can take to sort of sustain from a one-day sort of tree planting event to a longer term kind of citizen science monitoring program that would be hugely valuable, I think.
Great. We do now have a couple questions in regards to policy, which we touched on some. What are the biggest challenges you've faced in securing support from city governments or other policymakers to use the data to improve urban forests?
I think the key aspects is to understand what are the immediate concerns that they have. When we started our program in the greater Boston area, most city managers were not interested in working with free hands and some science, and I think where we sort of worked well with the city of Cambridge, and certainly in Southern California and other places, is sort of listening to where their immediate concerns are. In the case of city of Cambridge, they were getting a lot of citizens concerned that the young trees that the city of Cambridge was planting were just not surviving. And so we were able to provide the city with some data about the survivorship of young trees. And the city was able to present that back to the community members who in fact had helped collect some of the data and say, you see, we're not doing it so bad. And that was a sort of a win-win. And through that trust building and listening to what their needs were and providing it, we gained a level of a deeper relationship. I think with any community science program, citizen science program, the quality of the data is something that's always going to be discussed. At Earthwatch, we have a lot of very rigorous protocols for making sure we have high quality data. But showing those kinds of graphs that I showed earlier is something that really gained the trust of city managers to say, listen, what we do and how we do it can get you the kind of quality data that you can trust to make some of those decisions. And so those are the two sort of recommendations I would have in terms of developing relationships, is really understanding what they need and making sure that we support that in some way. And the other is, making sure that the kinds of data that we collect is of high quality, just as high quality as scientists, and that gains that trust for them to accept the information and make decisions from that.
Great, and then your answer might kind of feed into this next question here. But since in Boston here, we know that urbanization is happening rapidly, and the continued urban development, we're having a housing kind of crisis. So as cities plan to develop certain areas, whether it be for housing or whatever, how can we convince them to include urban resiliency in their planning, as when they have all these competing needs?
Great question. And that's one of the most important challenges, because there are, as any community seeks to sort of redevelop or invest, there are a lot of competing needs in terms of increased access and bicycle lanes and maybe more public transportation. And so green urban resiliency is just one piece of that. And so I think some of the kinds of solutions that I've seen work successfully is where everyone sort of sits around the table and looks at, how to bring all of that together. By having more trees, maybe it slows down traffic. By having trees in certain areas, and when I talk about trees, it's sort of any green infrastructure, and sometimes I slip into using trees, but it's how do we bring nature back into areas that can maybe slow down traffic or provide quiet little parks, or how do we plant trees on one side of a bike lane? And so it's trying to work across all those, different constituencies who have an interest in creating a resilient city that brings people out, that makes them more socially connected, that's more equitable. And so I think it's just taking a little bit of time of looking at the intersections between the green part of a city as well as all these other competing needs that need to be considered.
Great. So we have time for one more question. And just to bring it back to the citizen scientist, how can we get involved with programs like this?
So Earthwatch has a number of programs, and we're certainly happy to engage with different community members. I'd suggest that looking locally within your city for different community science programs. Again, community gardens are another great place to sort of think about this and supporting them. There's also a website called SCI Starter, SCI Starter, that is a big sort of aggregator of many different citizen science kind of projects. And you can filter different projects by the location you're in or by the topic you're interested in. And those will give you some sort of locally relevant opportunities for getting engaged locally if Earthwatch doesn't happen to have a project specifically where you're at.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark. It was very enlightening.
My pleasure.
If we weren't able to get to some of your questions, feel free to email us at communications@earthwatch.org, and we can either answer them or connect you with Mark. And also, we're going to have a recording of this webinar up later tonight and shared online tomorrow. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with your friends who aren't able to attend, that'll be ready for you. And our last webinar in the Forest series is going to be next month on December 17th with Earthwatch lead scientist Dave Olear, who is the lead scientist on the expedition following forest owls in the western US. So stay tuned for that. And thank you again for joining us today. Thanks. Thanks again, Mark.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.